Welcome back, everybody. I wanted to take a look at Milwaukee again because I've had a couple new ideas, and this one I've been fleshing out a little bit. I kind of like, and when your first idea ends up getting paved over like this, you just kind of have to hope that maybe you were wrong. So just continuing to kind of go through this one and look at it a little closer, and there was something that I came up with that I kind of liked as a potential idea that just started leading me down this path, and now I kind of like it. I kind of like where I've ended up, and so I just want to share it with you guys and get some feedback. So what we're first going to actually do is start in Cleveland, which seems a little bit weird, but I think there's some unfinished business with this Cleveland verse. And specifically, we're going to focus on these two lines right here where it says, Socrates, Pindar, Apelles, free speech, couplet, birch. Now, if we look back at Quest for Treasure, when Brian Zinn got back from visiting with Byron Price, he wrote down some notes about what Byron had told him. And so you can see right here, he said, from the Cleveland pick, he said that we got all the clues. Birch referred to a birch tree that had been there. Couplet had referred to a nearby poem, although Andy and I do not recall any nearby. Free speech refers to Socrates. And so these three guys here, Socrates is obviously the ancient Greek philosopher. Pindar was an ancient Greek poet, and Apelles was an ancient Greek artist. And so when we take a look at the Cleveland verse, you can see how free speech matches up underneath Socrates. And that makes sense because Socrates was basically persecuted for speaking his mind in a time when they really believed in their free speech, but he ultimately was persecuted for it, which is kind of ironic. Couplet, which is, if you take a look at what is a couplet is two lines of a verse, usually in the same meter and joined by rhyme. And so for them to be combined with Pindar, who was the ancient Greek poet, that makes a lot of sense. The third one is birch, which has it matched up with Apelles. Now Apelles was, like we said, an artist. The only reason we know about him is because Pliny the Elder wrote about him in the Natural History, and none of his paintings have survived. You can see that right here. We know about these, and none of them refer to anything that has to do with a birch tree. And so we know from Brian that there used to be a birch tree at this site, but why the connection with Apelles? Well, I have a hypothesis I'm gonna lay on you guys, and I'm gonna try to show some evidence for why I think this could actually be the answer. So we have free speech and Socrates, couplet and Pindar, birch and Apelles, and these two don't go together. Okay, what's interesting about the word couplet is it means two, and it's going to be a meter that's the same. Well, we have the word birch in another poem, in another verse, and that's the Milwaukee verse. And when you take a look at To the First Young Birch, it has 5 syllables, okay, just like this line does, free speech, couplet, birch. And so the meter, even though it's not the same rhythm, it does have the same amount of syllables. Now they end with the same word, and so the couplet is supposed to rhyme. Well, one type of a rhyme is what's known as an identical rhyme. And here's where I'm going to try to prove that this hypothesis is correct. And essentially, what I'm saying is that this line, free speech, couplet, birch, is a couplet with this line over here, to the first young birch. Those two lines together are going to form a couplet. Okay. Now, when we take a look at, I found this really interesting. Okay, this guy was asked about 2 lines ending with the same word, and so this guy was answering it, and he was talking about how it's an identical rhyme. So he says right here, a poetic form that employs identical rhyme is the ghazal, an ancient Urdu form that is being written in English more and more. The ghazal is a couplet or two-line form in which a repeated word appears at the end of both lines of the first couplet. So right there you have a form of poetry using an identical rhyme, and it's only used in a couplet. And that's what we have right here in this verse, is a reference to that. So the fact that this word and this word have the same word, so they're an identical rhyme, and this line and this line have an identical meter as far as syllables go, that's why I think they're a couplet. Now, going back to what Brian was told, the word birch referred to a birch tree that had been there, and couplet had referred to a nearby poem, and they didn't recall any other poems being nearby. I think Byron was giving them a hint. He was giving them the answers to the verse that they had solved. He was giving them a hint to the verse they had not solved, which was the Milwaukee verse, verse 8. And so basically the nearby poem that he's referring to is verse 8. It's nearby. It's in the book. It's only a couple pages away from verse 4. And so I think he was just being coy right there, where he didn't want to give away the connection because they hadn't solved verse 8. But he was willing to at least give them a hint. And so when you combine all of those things together, okay, what I think that means is that the couplet is essentially, from this side on the Cleveland one, the couplet is telling you that the word birch is going to be somehow tied to poetry through the combination of Pindar being a poet and the word couplet being tied together with that form of poetry with the identical rhyme. So now when you come over to here, everything starts to make sense. This is going to be a poetry reference. And so what do we got for the first young birch? Well, I've talked about this in my other video. We have the Robert Frost poem titled A Young Birch. And why this one in particular, obviously it has the word young birch in it, but it's also talking about the life cycle of the birch tree. And so when it's really young, it's no bigger than a cane. And so right there, that is almost word for word what we're looking for to the first young birch. So you're literally going to this poem and finding where it was a first young birch, and then it's no bigger than a cane. A cane is a synonym for a walking stick, and we know that we have a walking stick in the image for Milwaukee. So when you combine all of this together, I think that the Cleveland verse is actually providing a hint through the couplet and the word birch to verse 8. And you'll notice that it's verse 4 and verse 8. So a couplet is 2. So you'd essentially be multiplying 4 times 2 to get 8. So there's a nice little connection there. And then you have the number of syllables, so the meter's the same. And then you also have an identical rhyme with the word birch being used at the end of both lines. And we showed that connection between this literary form called the ghazal, which actually is a couplet. So I think it all ties together, and Price, being a publisher, would have definitely known, about that kind of writing form. Absolutely. So I'm gonna pause it right here, and then we're going to get into how I think this new way of looking at Milwaukee can kind of take us in a little bit of a different direction from where I ended up at the Schoenlieber building before. Sit tight.